Charles Ponzi, born Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi. In Italy! I know, I for one am utterly shocked with a name like that. And if his name sounds familiar to you, maybe you're like, wait, you mean Ponzi scheme? And yeah, that's where the name comes from. You're looking at the OG, the maker, the master, Charles Ponzi, who in 1920 swindled millions of dollars out of just so many people and paid for it because he was caught. But the scheme he used to do this would henceforth be known as a Ponzi scheme, although it is worth mentioning he didn't actually invent it. The scheme existed before him, but due to the level he was able to apply it in his particular case, he became famous for it. We've talked about plenty of scammers on the channel so far. I think it's about time we cover one of the most legendary of all time. Ponzi was born in Lugo, Emilia-Romagna, in the Kingdom of Italy at the time, on March 3rd, 1882. According to himself, his family was from Parma, and his ancestors were actually quite well off. They had a lot of money, but by the time Ponzi was born, that had changed significantly for his family. Despite the fact that his mother continued to use the title of Donna to refer to herself, it was just a formality. They were hardly nobles, they were hardly wealthy, or even well off. They were fairly poor. Not dirt poor, but pretty poor. And Ponzi's first job was as a postal worker, until he decided to attend the University of Rome La Sapienza. But he didn't take his education particularly seriously, despite it being possibly his golden opportunity to better his life. Instead, he followed around his friends, going to bars and cafes and all sorts of ritzy stuff because they were much more wealthy than he was. As a result, his studies suffered, and he would spend what little money he had. 4 years later, he had nothing, and he didn't even have a degree to show for it. And I mean, I know the typical joke with the college loans is that college students wind up broke by the end pretty much because of all that debt, but at least they have the degree. He didn't even have that much. But in those days, Italian immigrants to the United States were on the rise. A lot of people were coming over from Italy to, of course, America, the land of opportunity, stars and stripes, freedom, liberty.
To capitalism.
A lot of young Italian men had gone to America and come back with quite a lot of money, which they used to take care of their families. So Ponzi, because frankly he had nothing going for him back then, was encouraged by his own family to do the same. Go to America, become wealthy, come back and give us some money. Please, please, Charles, you're our only hope here. And we're probably betting on the wrong horse, but you're all we got, man. Ponzi would indeed head to America. He arrived in Boston, Massachusetts on November 15th, 1903 on board SS Vancouver. Though he showed up with basically nothing. He had been given a fair amount of money to get going by his family prior to leaving, but in true Ponzi fashion, he proceeded to gamble all of it on board the ship, leaving him with just $2.50. That's equivalent to a little less than $90 now, but that's still not a lot of money to know. He was broke. He didn't have anything. He also didn't speak any English at all, so he quickly had to learn that, which he did, and he proceeded to start doing odd jobs, since he didn't have any business ideas, and let alone the capital or contacts needed to start one up. He eventually stumbled into a job as a dishwasher in a restaurant, where he was allowed to sleep on the floor, since he had no other place to stay. He worked hard, though, and was eventually promoted to being a waiter, but then was fired for theft and shortchanging customers. So already swindling, huh? You just got here, man, and you're already trying to rob people. Come on now. By 1907, Ponzi was starting to think that maybe America wasn't all it was cracked up to be, that he wouldn't be able to achieve success here, but maybe further north he might have a chance. Canada, land of moose and maple syrup, where free medical care flows like wine. Except not back then. Well, the moose and the maple syrup was, not the healthcare. Anyway, he would move up to Montreal, Quebec, and got a job as an assistant teller at a newly opened bank known as Banco Zerosi. started up by Luigi Louis Zarossi, for the sole purpose of servicing the high amount of Italian immigrants that were arriving in Montreal at the time. A lot of Italians were coming across the Atlantic to North America. It wasn't just to the US, it was also up to Canada. Ponzi had charmed his way into the job. It helped that he was Italian, spoke Italian, but he also spoke both English and French, meaning he was perfect. And the thing about Ponzi that we're gonna establish is that he wasn't good at a lot of things, particularly business. He was actually really bad at business. But what Ponzi did have, the one advantage he had in life, the one thing God gave him to succeed, was an absolutely maxed out charisma stat. Dude was charming as all heck. And it was this trait that helped him, well, become so notorious. However, at this point, he was just doing an honest job at a bank, or so he thought. See, the bank wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Zarossi had stumbled into an issue, and it was at this point that Ponzi would first see the scam that his name would become synonymous with later in life. Zarossi was paying 6% interest on bank deposits, which was double the going rate at the time, so it was really good and attracted a lot of people to put their money into the bank. That seems great, especially for the immigrants, but Ponzi eventually was promoted to bank manager, and it was then he realized that, frankly, the bank was falling apart. They were in serious financial trouble, mostly because of a bunch of bad real estate loans. But Zarossi was continuing to fund the high interest payments, not through any profit on investments as he intended, but by utilizing the money that was being deposited in newly opened accounts. A classic Ponzi scheme, but back then they would have called it robbing Peter to pay Paul. In effect, all investment payouts were funded through new investments, and the scheme continues as long as new investments keep coming in, but will quickly fall apart if that stops, or if everyone decides to take their investment back all at the same time. Because this kind of scheme genuinely isn't actually making any money in the technical sense. It's not producing anything. What it's done is basically cause a money cycle, where you put money in and some people get money out, but in order to get the money out, other people have to keep putting the money in, because the money that's coming out is just the money that went in. It is not a legitimate business model at all, because it's completely unsustainable. And in this case, it absolutely was. The bank would fail. And since this was criminal, Zarossi would flee to Mexico, taking the remaining money with him. Bro literally robbed everybody and fled to Mexico. Classic. Ponzi, however, was not found guilty of any wrongdoing at the time, since he hadn't orchestrated the scheme and only found out about it when he was promoted to manager. He cooperated with authorities and was allowed to stay a free man. He remained in Montreal and began living at Zarossi's house because, in addition to fleeing the country and taking all the money, he also left his family behind. Ponzi would step up and assist the family however he could, but he didn't have a lot of money on his own since, well, he hadn't been involved in any kind of scheme. He was being paid regularly, but now he was out of a job. And he thought, well, I just saw my boss get in trouble for crime. Maybe the secret ingredient is crime. Also, no, Ponzi, that wasn't the lesson you were supposed to learn from this, but anyway, he wanted to go back to the United States at this point, but he didn't have the money to do that. So, as a quick solution, he would go to the offices of a former Zarossi customer, Canadian Warehousing, and discover that they weren't there at the time. But someone had left a checkbook there, so he proceeded to write himself a check for $423.58. He forged the signature of the director of the company, but he was quickly caught because police would notice that he started spending quite a bit of money just after the forged check had been cashed. When confronted, Ponzi would simply hold out his wrist and say, "I'm guilty." Well, at least he was honest about that. He was convicted and would spend 3 years as inmate number 6660 at St. Vincent de Paul Federal Penitentiary, a facility that was pretty infamous at the time, because even by early 1900s prison standards, it was a pretty awful place to be. When he was released in 1911, he did finally return to the United States, but almost immediately became involved in some more criminal enterprises. This time he was helping smuggle Italian illegal immigrants across the border. He was caught again and spent 2 years in Atlanta prison. But his charisma continued to help him even behind bars. He became a translator for the warden, because at the time, the warden was intercepting letters that were being written from the notorious Italian mobster, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo. Lupo is his own story, but Ponzi ended up becoming pretty good friends with him, as well as another prisoner named Charles W. Morse. Morse had been a wealthy Wall Street businessman and speculator, but he was also a career fraudster and scammer. A lot of what Morse did was very, very, very not legal, and that included getting himself released from prison. In order to pretend that he was in very poor health and couldn't stay there anymore, he would consume soap shavings to make himself sick. Really? This worked. He was released, but his friendship with Ponzi had an effect. Ponzi respected Morse and had learned quite a bit from him. Mostly how to grift, how to scam, how to get away with stuff that you aren't supposed to do, because it's against the law. Once Ponzi was released from prison, he would head back to Boston again, taking a job at a mining camp as a nurse, interestingly enough. It was at this point that he came up with an idea that involved going to a separate mining camp and starting a utility there that would supply water and power, and then selling stock in it. But it was also during this time that Ponzi would do something genuinely kind. It's the thing about Ponzi. Yeah, he is a career scammer, but he's not a monster. One of his fellow nurses, named Pearl Gosid, suffered catastrophically severe burns in an accident. Ponzi didn't even know this woman, but he would volunteer to undergo 2 major operations and donate 122 square inches of his own skin from his back and legs to Pearl. It was a genuinely kind thing to do, but it resulted in several complications, and Ponzi was unceremoniously fired, which is rude. Like, seriously? The man just helped this woman out, and you're gonna fire him for that? After he did recover, he would be forced to travel around and look for more work. And that's when he met Rose Maria Necco, and promptly fell in love with her. Rose came from a family of Italian-American immigrants who ran a small fruit stall in downtown Boston. Ponzi didn't actually tell her about his criminal past at the time, though his mother would. Thanks, Mom. But Rose really did love him, probably due to that max charisma stat, remember? He was charming as heck. And the two would marry in 1918. Ponzi would work at a number of businesses trying to support his wife, and that included his father-in-law's fruit stand, as well as the import-export company J.R. Poole. He tried to come up with a lot of new business ideas about this point, but no one really was interested in what he had going for him. He would even eventually take over his wife's family's fruit stand, attempting to build it up to something bigger, but that also failed. So Ponzi settled into, well, basically selling ideas. He set up a small office at 27 School Street in Boston in the summer of 1919. This particular business was literally selling business ideas over to his contacts in Europe. Selling business ideas, mind you, that no one wanted. Like, if he was selling business ideas, why not use those business ideas for yourself? It wasn't an outright scam, but obviously it wasn't really a good business model. I guess you could argue he was being a consultant, but given he had very little experience in any kind of business to a significant degree, and the experience he had was wrought with failure and crime, not exactly the kind of person that would succeed in this particular trade. But this is when he stumbled upon his big idea. Ponzi would get a letter from a company located in Spain, asking about an advertising catalog concept that Ponzi was working on. This particular idea was to sell advertising in a large business listing, which sounds a little bit like the Yellow Pages. It was actually a good idea, but no one bid back then. But this letter came from Spain, remember, and it would include what's called an International Reply Coupon, or IRC, and that is super-de-duper relevant to our story. An IRC is a type of coupon that can be exchanged for one or more postage stamps representing the minimum postage for an unregistered priority airmail letter sent to another member of the Universal Postal Union, or UPU. Now, why would the letter include that? Well, that's because the purpose of an IRC is to let a person send someone in another country a reply in the form of a letter without actually having to incur the cost of the postage associated with that themselves. If you're sending a letter to someone in the same country, an IRC isn't necessary because you can just use a self-addressed stamped envelope or return postcard, but that isn't applicable across national lines, because you'd need foreign postage, or you'd need to send them the appropriate currency to buy foreign postage. An IRC makes this process easier, because you can just trade it in for the necessary postage for the reply. And since the Spanish company was soliciting a reply, it seemed in good form to send an IRC along with their letter. But Ponzi would realize that there was somewhat of a weakness when it came to the IRCs. Something he could exploit and make money, profit, millions of dollars. Maybe, definitely, probably not, but there was an idea. IRCs were priced at the cost of postage in the country of purchase, but were redeemed in the other country regardless of that price. That meant that if the cost of postage in one country was different from the other, you could possibly make money off of that exchange. You get a hold of the postage, sell it for the normal rate, and make a profit since the IRC would have cost less in the other country. Postage was comparatively cheap over in Italy, but more expensive in America. Meaning you could buy an IRC in Italy, take it over to America, trade it in, sell off the US postage, and make a profit off of that. Right? Well, there's some holes here. For one thing, this whole scheme isn't really a business idea at all, if you think about it. All he's doing is exploiting a governmental oversight between nations. He's not producing a product or service of any kind. So I'm hesitant to even call it business, because it really isn't. You're not selling anything. I mean, I guess you're selling postage, but that's something anyone else could get from the government for the same amount of money. It's not really a business model in that sense. You're just benefiting off of the IRC price difference. And if the countries suddenly standardized their postage to be the same price, you wouldn't be making any money off of it. Plus, you gotta consider the cost of getting the IRCs over the Atlantic if we're talking about getting them from Italy. I suppose you could do it with other countries too, depending on the exchange, but you're still talking about shipping them across the Atlantic, and that on its own is gonna cost money. Ponzi's idea on its own is a form of arbitrage, and it is legal. He wasn't breaking the law when it came to this concept, but he would be quite quickly when he realized how, unachievable this idea was. But Ponzi committed directly to it. He quit his job as a translator and started seeking investors to make this happen. He tried to get a loan, but none of the banks were interested. Frankly, no one believed it could work, and they were right. So instead, he set up a stock company to raise money from the public. He utilized his charming ways and convinced various friends and contacts that he could double their investment in just 90 days. He created the net profit between the IRC exchange rates was in excess of 400%, which would have been insane, and people believed him. In the first month, 18 people invested in his new company for a total of $1,800. And the very next month, he paid them exactly what he said he was going to. And this made it appear that the whole thing was legit. People flocked to Ponzi to invest, and he would pay them back as promised. But behind the scenes, well, you can probably imagine what was actually going on here. Again, we're talking about a scheme, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And, well, the Ponzi scheme. This whole thing would be named after him. And indeed, that's exactly what he was doing. He was paying off previous investors with the new investors, just as his former boss Zerosi had done a decade prior. And this is because, frankly, there was no way that the IRCs were going to be able to pay out the way Ponzi thought they would. If we just take the initial 18 investors into account, all putting their money in January of 1920, in order to pay them back in the same way Ponzi had promised, it would have taken 53,000 of the coupons to actually hit the profits that Ponzi guaranteed. And this amount only got more insane as the investors increased in number over time. You would need a lot of these coupons, and not only a lot of the coupons, but you had to trade them all in, get the postage, and then sell the postage in a very quick and timely manner. And that wasn't really feasible at all. But Ponzi still kept at it. And as more people threw money into the securities exchange company, he would hire agents and paid them very generous commissions to spread the word and get even more investors, because the whole scheme hinged on getting as many investors as possible and continuing that trend. By May of 1920, he had made $420,000. That's equivalent to nearly $7 million in today's money, by the way. And then by June, people had invested nearly $2.5 million, equivalent to over $39 million today. This was a lot of money passing through Ponzi's hands, and he would deposit pretty much all of it in the Hanover Trust Bank of Boston. This was on purpose, and it was strategic. See, Ponzi isn't a complete idiot, alright? He isn't good at a lot, except perhaps charisma, but he wasn't stupid. Remember, he had seen this very same scheme a decade prior, and he also knew how it had ended up. He knew full well that this wasn't going to last forever. It could unravel very quickly. So his plan wasn't to commit to it. He felt that with the money he now held, he could use it to actually start a proper legitimate business. And with the profits from that legitimate business, he could keep funneling money back to the scheme and hopefully eventually ease things down and stop doing it entirely. Then he'd be left with a legitimate business, happy investors that had gotten paid out, and people would be none the wiser that he had started things off with a straight-up scam. Depositing the money in that small bank was a big part of this plan. He felt that if he had a large enough account in the bank, he would have enough pull to, well, directly influence it, or even be made president. He would buy a controlling interest in the bank through both himself and several friends after depositing $3 million. And he would expand SEC, setting up branches as far north as Maine and as far south as New Jersey. And part of what kept the scheme afloat was that investors often didn't just run away once they got their profits. No, they would reinvest. Gambler's logic. Well, I'm on a roll. I can make even more. Here, take the money again, Ponzi, please. Give me more money on your scheme. And he was happy to take it again, because goodness, he needed it. He likely realized pretty quick that the IRCs weren't actually gonna be a feasible business option at all, so he never really made any attempt to get a hold of them. It was a flat-out lie by that point, and he was trying his best to find other options for money, stuff that might actually work. But if you think he lived frugally, knowing that he was running a scam that could fall apart at any moment, no, of course not. That's ridiculous. He had to keep up appearances after all. He would buy a mansion in Lexington, Massachusetts, and maintain multiple accounts in several banks across New England. Not just Hanover Trust. He bought a locomobile, which was a fancy car back then, and even planned a long-delayed honeymoon with his wife by purchasing 2 first-class tickets to Italy, but instead changed them in to bring his mother from Italy to the US to stay with them as her health was starting to fail her. She would live with Ponzi and Rose for some time, but did pass away not long after she arrived. He would also purchase a macaroni company and part of a wine company in an attempt to gain profits for his scheme. But the thing about Ponzi, probably more than anything else, is that anytime he touched a legitimate business, it seemed to just collapse immediately. Like he had this curse. If it wasn't a scam, he couldn't do anything with it. And things would start to fall apart pretty quick. See, the actual rich people in the area were starting to get a little suspicious of Ponzi. This was seemingly a pure rags-to-riches story. He had nothing, he was dirt poor, and now he was a millionaire in the span of months. Not years, months, which is practically unheard of. Unless you get an inheritance or win the lottery, like that's not a thing. But for a time, many found it difficult to levy criticism at Ponzi because, well, the first time someone did it, they were sued. Ponzi sued them for libel after they accused him of not being able to deliver on these high returns that didn't make any sense. And Ponzi won $500,000 in damages. This was because libel law at the time was written in such a way that it placed the burden of proof on both the writer and publisher of whatever the criticism was. And if they couldn't prove it, well, it was libel, as far as the courts were concerned. But he couldn't silence everybody this way, and others started criticizing him. Joseph Daniels, a Boston furniture dealer who had given Ponzi furniture which he couldn't afford, would sue him for that furniture, and he failed because he had given it to him and knew that he couldn't pay for it. He was trying to be nice, and then only when Ponzi had money did he want it. But it did attract further attention to people being more critical of him. It even panicked the investors slightly, and there was a run on the Securities Exchange Company. A run, or bank run, occurs when many clients from some kind of financial institution all withdraw their money at the same time. That's what that means. And indeed, many did try to get their money back and pull out of Ponzi's scheme. But the thing was, Ponzi paid them everything they were owed, promptly, and with a smile. His calm nature and friendly demeanor made it so that the investors would calm down pretty quick, and the run stopped. Then on July 24th, 1920, the Boston Post printed a favorable article on Ponzi, which caused investors to flood in to give him their money. The day after the article was published, Ponzi would arrive at his office to find a whole crowd of people begging, pleading, "Please, sir, take our money!" And he did. Because of course he did. But the acting publisher of the Post, Richard Grozier, and the city's editor, Eddie Dunn, were pretty suspicious and decided to assign some investigative reporters to look further into Ponzi. State officials were also very interested in what he was up to, not really believing he could actually make all this money. When they showed up to meet with him, they wanted to take a look at his books, but he was able to dissuade them from this by promising to stop taking money during their investigation. But this did put off the state officials from pushing any further, which is great since Ponzi was never at any point keeping proper records in any way. He kept investors' names on index cards, that was it. The Post would continue investigating, and eventually contacted Clarence Barron, who was a financial journalist who headed Dow Jones and Company. They asked him to look into Ponzi and see what he thought. The first thing Barron noticed, which was definitely a red flag, was that Ponzi himself didn't invest in his own company. Why not? If there were such high returns, wouldn't he want to take advantage of that too? Barron also did what no one else had bothered to do at this point, for some reason. Math. Basic friggin' math. Barron would calculate how much of the IRC's Ponzi would actually need to be able to deliver on all these investments. And he came to the conclusion that 160 million of the coupons had to be in circulation. He then proceeded to check how many actually were, because the federal government does keep track of that. There were only about 27,000. The United States Post Office would also clarify that since Ponzi had started his business, there hadn't been any increase in postal reply coupon purchases or redemptions, stateside or abroad. And if Ponzi was doing what he said he was doing, then there should have been a staggering uptick. But there wasn't. Barron would also point out, as I did earlier, that in order to handle the logistics of actually buying and selling the IRCs, the overhead was too much, completely defeating any possible profit to be made off of them. And even if what Ponzi was saying was somehow true, that he was somehow making money this way, Barron pointed out that it was just exploiting a hole in the government system. It wasn't a legitimate business in any way. He wasn't producing anything. He wasn't really selling anything, be it a product or a service. And it was something that could easily fall apart if the government changed their policies. And as far as he was concerned, it was immoral. It wasn't honest, even if it was working as advertised, and it wasn't even doing that. These articles would cause another run to occur. Ponzi would be forced to pay out about $2 million over the course of 3 days. But true to his form, he would continue being his cheerful self. He passed out coffee and donuts, talked calmly to everybody, and told them that there was nothing to worry about. It was just a silly article from the press that didn't know what they were talking about. You guys are fine. And everyone got their money who asked for it, so there was again no reason for his investors to really question him too hard. But the state government of Massachusetts was still looking into Ponzi. They'd been put off for a while, but they were looking back into it. Daniel Gallagher, who was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, would commission Edwin Pride to audit the company's books, which again consisted of index cards with investors' names, weren't really proper books at all, which was a red flag if ever there was one. And Ponzi made attempts to fight back, not by suing this time, but by hiring a publicist named William McMasters. And this would prove to be a pretty critical mistake on Ponzi's part. McMasters may have been working for Ponzi, but Masters had pretty staunch morals, and quickly realized that Ponzi was kind of full of it. He would personally find several highly incriminating documents that showed what Ponzi was actually doing. robbing Peter to pay Paul. McMasters went directly to Richard Grozier, as he had worked for him in the past, and Grozier offered him $5,000 for the story, which McMasters gladly gave over. It was published in the Post on August 2nd, 1920, and the article declared Ponzi hopelessly insolvent, revealing that he was at least $2 million in debt, and again caused a massive run on SEC. Ponzi would pay off everybody in one day. Again. Man, he is good at that. You gotta give him credit. But he knew time was running out. The authorities were getting too close, and they had found legitimate documents that pointed out to what he was actually doing. So he sped up plans to build up an actual company that would engage in both banking and import and export operations. That's what he wanted to do. And if he could form a legitimate business rather quickly, he'd be able to get himself out of this. But there was just no more time, especially since the authorities were concerned about the local economy as a result of Ponzi's activities. See, Massachusetts Bank Commissioner Joseph Allen was deeply alarmed that if the major withdrawals exhausted what money Ponzi did have, it could cause the whole city's banking system to fall apart. There was too much money tied up in his scheme, a significant portion of the money in the city. This is not good. Allen would also find out that Ponzi had been taking out a bunch of loans from Hanover Trust in order to fund his operations because, well, he didn't actually have money that he was making legitimately, remember? And would have two bank examiners keep an eye on Ponzi's accounts to see what they were doing. By August 9th, they would report back saying that enough investors had cashed their checks on Ponzi's main account that there was no way there was any money actually in it. It had to be overdrawn. Allen would then order Hanover Trust not to pay out any more checks from Ponzi's main account, and orchestrated an involuntary bankruptcy. This forced Massachusetts Attorney General J. Weston Allen to release a statement that there was little to support Ponzi's claims, and that frankly this whole thing was hogwash, and it always had been. Edwin Pride was also almost done with his audit of Ponzi's books, and by books I mean note cards, and he delivered a preview to Ponzi, revealing that he was $7 million in debt. At minimum. So that's not good. On August 11th, the Post published another story focusing on Ponzi's criminal activities up in Montreal, 13 years prior. That same day, Allen would seize Hanover Trust due to all the ridiculous irregularities going on, and that inadvertently foiled Ponzi's new scheme to get out of this, because he was still trying to figure out a way out of this, mind you. He wanted to borrow funds from the bank vaults directly as a last resort option, but he was never able to do that. The press was on fire when it came to reporting on Ponzi, and most believed that he'd be placed under arrest sometime soon. As a result, Ponzi decided to surrender to federal authorities. He didn't run, and he accepted Pride's audit. He'd be charged at a federal level of mail fraud. Initially, he'd be released on a $25,000 bail, but was immediately rearrested on the charges of larceny, for which he had to post an additional $10,000 bond. But given how major this was and how much money was really involved, the bail bondsmen started fearing that Ponzi might try to flee the country, so they withdrew the bail for those charges. Because, really, this was very bad for pretty much anybody. All of Ponzi's investors were effectively wiped out, because duh, and they would receive less than 30 cents to the dollar as a result. A total of 6 banks, including Hanover Trust, would collapse, and the amount of money lost in total was around $20 million. That's over $314 million in today's money. To date, it's not the largest Ponzi scheme in history, but at the time it was pretty friggin' major, and his name became associated with it. We still call it that now. But what about him? Did he go to jail? Oh yeah, he went to jail, definitely. On the 2 federal indictments, he was charged with 86 counts of mail fraud and faced life imprisonment. His wife, who was still with him, stood by him throughout this, encouraged him to try to take some kind of deal, some kind of plea bargain to lessen the sentence so he didn't have to spend the rest of his life behind bars. And he did. He would come to an agreement and plead guilty on November 1st, 1920, to a single count before Judge Clarence Hall. He'd be sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He'd be released after 3.5 years, but almost immediately was indicted again on 22 state charges of larceny. Yeah, he'd only went to jail for the federal stuff. The state of Massachusetts was still waiting, just waiting to get him. Ponzi was shocked by this. He thought the plea bargain had included the state charges, that they'd be dropped too, but that wasn't the case. He did sue, not believing this was fair at all, and claimed that he would be facing double jeopardy. It rose to the Supreme Court, and on March 27, 1922, they ruled that federal plea bargains have no standing regarding state charges. Plus, Massachusetts was charging him with larceny. The feds had gotten him on mail fraud, so those were two different types of crimes, meaning that Massachusetts was free to take Ponzi to court again. He had no money at this point. He was flat friggin' broke, so he couldn't afford an attorney and opted to serve as his own. Now, normally, this is a really bad idea. Don't do that. Hopefully you won't find yourself in court, but if you do, don't serve as your own attorney unless you are one. And even if you are one, usually attorneys hire other attorneys to help them out with court cases. Ponzi served as his own, and to an extent it actually was a good idea, because remember, max charisma stat. Ponzi put forth a very solid defense and charmed the jury, and that trial was acquitted on those first 10 larceny counts. But there were still 5 more that weren't a part of that one, so he had to go to court again. This time it resulted in a hung jury, and there was a third trial. This time his luck ran out, and he was found guilty, sentenced to an additional 7 to 9 years. Ponzi would, however, appeal this, and in September of 1925 he was released on bail as a part of that. But this time he did flee, all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida, and launched a new business! Yeah, a legitimate one, for realsies, I promise, in real estate! Yeah! Oh no. He called it the Sharpen Land Syndicate, and he was looking to capitalize on the Florida land boom. He offered investors land and promised them 200% returns in 60 days, which... Wait a minute, Ponzi. Ponzi, are you doing it? Is this the same thing again? Well, not exactly, because in this instance, he was selling land that wasn't actually usable land. It was Florida swampland. Some of it was underwater. So yeah, it was another scam. Great. He was indicted by a Duval County grand jury in February of 1926 on this, and charged with violating Florida trust and securities laws. He was found guilty on the securities charges, and he was sentenced to a year in the Florida State Prison. He appealed and was freed after posting a $1,500 bond. He then traveled to Tampa, where he would shave his head, grow a mustache, and tried to flee the country as a crewman on a merchant ship bound for Italy. He wasn't Ponzi, alright? He was Luigi. I am Luigi. I am not Ponzi. I don't know who that is. Absolutely, 100%. We believe you. But he, like an idiot, revealed his identity to one of his shipmates, and they reported him. A deputy sheriff would eventually find out, and they would catch up with the ship at its final American port of call in New Orleans. They arrested Ponzi, and this time weren't going to let him out. He would then get really desperate and plead to both President Calvin Coolidge and rather infamous Italian leader in those days, Benito Mussolini, asking them to please deport him back to Italy. And they both ignored him, as you can imagine. He'd be sent back to Massachusetts to serve out his prison term, which lasted 7 more years. He'd be released in 1934, but this is when they decided to deport him. At a point when he wouldn't want to be deported, of course. He would attempt to ask for a full pardon from Massachusetts Governor Joseph B. Ely, who didn't give him that, because no. And on October 7th, he was officially sent back to Italy. His wife Rose didn't want to leave the United States, and divorced her husband in 1937. Back in Italy, Ponzi remained fairly poor. He attempted some new schemes, but none of them actually did much of anything for him. He would eventually stumble into a legitimate job, located in Brazil, working as an agent for Alla Littoria, the Italian state airlines. But then World War II happened. The airline's operation in the country was shut down after British intelligence services intervened, and Brazil would side with the Allies in the conflict, since Italy was being very, very naughty but not quite as naughty as their other two major allies. Ala Litteria wasn't allowed to work in Brazil anymore, and Ponzi was out of a job. He would live the rest of his life in complete poverty. Occasionally, he got some work as a translator, but that was about it. Into the 1940s, his health was falling apart. A heart attack hit him in 1941, and then his eyesight started going. By 1948, he was almost completely blind. Then, he suffered a brain hemorrhage, paralyzing both his left leg and arm. He would die in a charity hospital in Rio de Janeiro, Hospital São Francisco de Assis, on January 18th, 1949. In his last years, he was supported by his only remaining friend, a man named Francisco Nonato Nunes. And just prior to his death, he did give one last interview to an American reporter, going out with a quote that I think sums up his personality more than anything else. Because, despite all the wrong he did, he never regretted it, saying, even if they never got anything for it, it was cheap at that price. Without malice aforethought, I had given them the best show that was ever staged in their territory since the landing of the Pilgrims. It was easily worth $15 million to watch me pull the thing over. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.